Hi, everyone. This is Matt with ESI Survival Guide. We are an online resource designed to help legal professionals navigate the electronic wilderness. You can find us on Instagram at ESI Survival Guide and on Twitter at eDiscovery Guide. We're also revamping the website, www.esisurvivalguide.com. And we also have an NFT project coming out soon. So feel free to check that out. Of course, if you want to support the channel, feel free to subscribe, hit the notification bell to find out when we put new videos out. And if you like the video, hit the like button. Feel free to leave us a comment. We definitely love feedback and want this to be an ongoing conversation. And before I introduce our guests, let me give you the obligatory disclaimer. The thoughts, views, and opinions expressed by myself and my guest today are those of us individually and not necessarily those of our respective organizations. If you are facing a legal issue, consult a lawyer, the same way that if you're facing a medical issue, consult a doctor. So this is meant to be educational and entertaining, and not legal advice. So definitely take note of that. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce James Casey. James, welcome to the channel. How are you, sir?
I'm great today, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very good. If I could, I wanted to introduce you real quick to our viewers. James is a e-discovery and data protection and privacy attorney and a research and development professional. And James, your career spans a whole host of different hats and also a whole host of different geographies. If I can try and pin you down here, you're based out of San Antonio, Texas, correct?
Correct, yes.
Wonderful. But recently you just finished a role as the interim director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at Florida Gulf Coast University. And you are a founding adjunct associate professor at CUNY in New York for the Research Administration and Compliance Program. Those are just two of the academic hats that you've worn in your illustrious career. You've worked in legal, government, private and public sectors, and also the litany of honors and awards that you have too is very impressive. You're a Wisconsin delegate to the ABA House of Delegates. You are the vice chair of the ABA E-Privacy Committee and the past president of the State Bar of Wisconsin Non-Resident Lawyers Division. Is there anything that I left out there that you'd like to share?
I think that's probably enough. My education after college really prepared me for different things in my career. That's really what I wanted to do, which is why I've worked in 3 sectors of the economy and have been able to integrate many things together. So it was always a conscious choice. You know, I mean, I went to law school at Dayton, but you know, and I'm a writer, so I was on law review, but I didn't have this burning desire to be a trial attorney, although I did that at one point. But I think the value of a legal education is to prepare you to do a lot of things and become a valuable member of society, even if sometimes lawyers get a bad rap on the late night talk shows and in newspapers and what have you. So.
Sure. That was always the brilliant advice of my dad too, who was probably one of my biggest influences in my life, is he always told me, go to law school so you have everything to fall back on it. And it worked out good for me because I think at the time, my career goal was to be a musician, which probably would not have worked out as well for me as being in the law. And by the way, for those who are probably trying to look past James as you're watching the video, that is an amazing framed Rolling Stones piece there in the back. So we talked about that before the interview. Let's go ahead and jump right in. And let me tell the viewers out there, James, the path that I took to find you and why we're having this conversation is I read an article that you wrote in the Wisconsin Lawyer. And this article actually is a 2-piece article. I read the first one that I believe came out in March. The most recent one just came out in May. And
Yes.
I think the title of the first one that I read was Nudges, Algorithms, and Human Choice. What does the future hold? And if I could, to set the stage for our discussion, I want to read a little bit of the first piece that you wrote in that two-part series for the Wisconsin Lawyer. You wrote, human choice should not be compromised on the altar of convenience. Human choice has already been compromised thanks to the algorithm. This development should concern everyone. Should humankind serve technology or should technology serve us? I hope that everyone would agree with the latter. This leads to one final question. How can this percolating battle between human choice and algorithms and technology be mediated? This is a paramount question of our time. So James, set the stage for us. What is this battle that you're describing?
I think the battle is the increasing rapidity of advancing technology, and technology is being implemented faster. There are trends that are in the newspapers, it's trumpeted, and before you know it, people glom onto it and implement it without thinking about it or what the implications are. And that is the battle. And that really, although technology has always been changing, with the advent of the internet in the mid-90s, change has been coming at an increasingly rapid rate. As I mentioned in the March piece, I was fortunate enough to work in the real world before the internet. Now that some people would say that would date me, I say it gives you a perspective of what it once was like to work in the modern world with slow computers or no computers. And how, let's say back then, you had more time to make decisions. If you're in government, if you're in business, if you're in academia, and now you have less and less time to make decisions. And it's coupled with information overload, what we call big data, which is tackled now by what we'd call machine learning, which is advanced algorithms. And so the battle has always been with us, but it's coming at an increasingly rapid rate. And that, I think, is the challenge. So you have the challenge of technology versus humanity, but there's another dimension that is mentioned in the article, which is the battle between democracy, consent, and choice and technology. Or you could frame it another way of saying that this is a pitched battle between personal freedoms and the public welfare. That phrase, the public welfare, was much more common 1 or 2, 3, 4 generations ago than now, because I can name a whole bunch of areas, including in the whole pandemic vaccine mask area, where this now, once again, has become a matter of personal freedom versus public welfare. And so algorithms, same thing, because, the March issue, and as you say in your intro, how free are we? If all of us, whether we're purchasing from Amazon, whether our local government has implemented algorithms to make basic decisions of government services, because then they don't have to hire as many human beings, in other words, just farming out to the computers, or in the criminal justice system, which is in the May article about how algorithms are used for pretrial sentencing reports now. And what is in the algorithms? There's a few ways to skin this cat.
Let me take a step back real quick. And I want to address the whole notion of criminal sentencing. I know another area where algorithm decision-making comes into play is also with regards to some pretrial aspects, including setting bail and whatnot.
Bail,
When we talk about this dynamic between free choice and the algorithm, what comes to mind is Cambridge Analytica. During the last presidential election, how different social media platforms might have been influenced the vote and people's free choice around voting. But aren't we simply, whether or not we think we're living in the matrix, aren't we just confirming and finding the things that already conform to our beliefs anyways? I mean, if I'm being presented with things based on what a computer assesses from my behavioral patterns online, and I'm following the rabbit hole of those articles or whatnot, isn't it just simply building upon what I already believe and the choices that I would already make, as opposed to forcing me to make different choices? Isn't it just reconfirming what I already would do otherwise?
Well, I think what distinguishes now against 20 or 30 years ago is how quick you get that feedback and how quick you get the confirmation. When we had issues in the United States with issues of race, what happened in Texas yesterday, okay, just west of here, 80 miles. And it can be in other areas that have nothing to do with Cambridge Analytica or Amazon or Facebook selling data or whatever you want to talk about. But the reality is that finding your tribe, which is maybe what you're talking about, people that hold a cluster that, your group that holds the same confirmed view of the world as you do, that's coming much quicker. And there's so much disinformation out there that how can people really sort through it in real time?
Right, right. And I guess you could think of it this way. When you think of nudging, and we'll talk about some of these definitions here in a second, it can serve a good purpose. I think oftentimes developers talk about enhancing the user experience, and that these algorithms, just like Netflix is presenting you with movies. If you like this, you probably like this, things like that. But then if you think about it from, what I like about your article is something that I always harp on. At the end, you really harp on the fact that education is the best remedy to a lot of this. But if you don't have that education, and I'm not saying this based on opinions, if you're misinformed, or whether it's just from ignorance or even worse, from a nefarious outside influence, reinforcing that lack of education, that could be a very bad thing. And I think that's where the political realm, it can get a little dicey. To what extent are our choices being influenced by misinformation as opposed to directing us towards finding our tribe, as you say? But real quick, let's jump into a couple definitional items. So we've set the stage of what this percolating battle looks like. Let's do some vocabulary, if you will. So I'm going to give you a couple words that you define in your first article in the Wisconsin Lawyer. Although it might seem obvious to a lot of our tech friends out there, algorithm. How do you define algorithm?
Algorithms are instructions or computer code generally set up by either computer engineers or computer scientists behind firewalls to make certain decisions or tasks, and how you accomplish that. And that talks about the education part. The reason I got into privacy and data protection 6 years ago and all this stuff with algorithms now is not because I was an engineer. I'm not. I was schooled in public policy and poli-sci law, right? And so, I mean,
I was a history major.
And that's probably even more useless, than a poli-sci major.
Sorry, Mom and Dad.
So I don't mean to offend any history majors on this video today, but that's the reality of it. I started looking around. I saw the data breaches. Okay, I was a good Boy Scout growing up. I believe that capitalism is the best system and it's largely perfect, and that's the best way to allocate goods, services, and what have you. But there's been a lot of data breaches: credit cards, social security cards, PII, PHI, you name it. Okay. And the companies were always late to the party. They're fixing it. They'll give you a year's free fraud reporting tool to use in case your data was stolen. But it was never fixed on the front end. And when it's gone out the back end, it's too late. And so I think what you got is I just started looking at this and seeing, well, many modern companies have just not been as proactive as they should have been. And that got me into all of this to start with.
Sure. Isn't by its very nature, though? I mean, I think you highlight right there another issue of this problem. There's a book by Ray Kurzweil, The Singularity is Near. And those of you out there that know the singularity is essentially this concept that at some point, technology and technological developments will just snowball so much they almost become out of human control. And they rapidly change the kind of human experience so much that it's almost, it overtakes the human experience, if you will. And to what extent then can we ever be proactive in this space. If we're looking at algorithms and part of what we're trying to do is maybe educate folks so they can understand the factors that underlie algorithms to make proactive choices, at some point, isn't that going to be beyond our control? Isn't the technology going to get so out of control that almost everything we do is reactive?
Well, in a worst case scenario, I would say yes. But as I mentioned in the March article, using algorithms by itself is an assistance to humans. Humans should be making the decisions, not the computers. And that goes to one of the quotes you had early on. So I think artificial intelligence as a general category can be a good thing if it is used judiciously, and the human beings, whether it's in a courtroom, whether it's in local government, whether it's in higher ed, the federal government, whatever, they have the final call on all this. And I think that is the kind of the scary part of what happens when the data gets too big, when the population of the country gets too big. I mean, we're at 330 million approximately right now. And you look at what China's doing. China is much bigger population wise, and they're not even democratic. Okay, so let's call it for what it is. They're not a democracy. So many, my articles this spring in the Wisconsin Lawyer are really geared toward democratic societies where choice and consent are basically concepts baked into our government, the Constitution, the court decisions, the Bill of Rights, and the equivalents you'd have overseas, let's say in Europe and a few other parts of the world. But in some parts of the world, there is no democracy.
Right.
It's authoritarianism, and or worse, it's chaos.
Right.
And which is an even scarier prospect in those parts of the planet that are using AI, but there is no democratic brakes against the use or abuse of it. And I think one final big concept for today's video is that algorithms and using them to make decisions are only as good as the data that goes in. It's like the old phrase, garbage in equals garbage out. And if the data that goes into algorithms or into machine learning is biased, discriminatory, incomplete, what are you going to get coming out?
Right. And that harkens to facial recognition technology and the algorithms there, where there's a Netflix movie, Coded Bias, that talks about how a lot of these algorithms for detecting skin tone, they're not very good at detecting darker skin tones and the implications that can have. So yeah, I mean, definitely, I think a lot of folks don't think about the fact that we trust these algorithms, or whether we trust them or not, we kind of assume they operate at a certain level of non-bias. But at the end of the day, humans built them, and humans have biases. One thing, and we won't get into it too in depth here, but talking about China and their national scoring system, I think that is a very scary situation when it comes to the use of AI and machine learning and algorithms and how it can impact people. But I like this notion of the Bill of Rights and the fundamental freedoms that we talk about in America, although privacy isn't necessarily one of them in our sectoral framework. But I like this notion that maybe we can ground our fears about the expansion of technology and technology run amok in those rights. I did an interview with Lewis Cohen about NFTs, and in talking about the craziness of NFTs and how all of these new scenarios were arising where it wasn't clear what legal concepts applied, Lewis had a very good survival tip where he said, look, we have to ground all of these things in existing law, and we can bring them back to existing legal concepts, which have to apply. Right. And I think you bring up a good point that if we focus on the fundamental rights of humans and how we interact as a society, trying to, at least from a general sense, slot in these developments in technology into those rights, making sure they conform to those rights and are protected by mechanisms designed to protect those rights. That might be a good place to start to avoid. Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned in the March article, machines should serve humankind. What we do in technology should support democracy, should support human choice. I believe that privacy is a basic human right. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not even explicitly anywhere in US statute, well, the Constitution, let's say, compared to what they do over with the GDPR in Europe.
Sure.
I think it should be there. And I would hope that when the US government gets its act together and has an overarching privacy statute, that a definitive statement will be made that privacy is a basic human right in the United States. Now, let the lawsuits fly and let the Supreme Court say something about that. But I think we've kind of lost our way when we focus on the individual minutia of cases and we don't talk about what's best for the public at large. So machines should serve us, but I know sometimes I feel like I have to serve the machine. I don't like that. It's like you go to an ATM, you put your card in, you get your money out. Okay. Your card comes out like a half inch. And if you don't pull that card out in 2 seconds, it starts beeping.
Right.
Oh boy. I'm like, I'm sorry, but I don't report to you, Mr. ATM. I know the reasoning behind it, but you kind of get the feeling that maybe it's gone too far in that one direction. It's like, and this would be another topic for another day, I guess. But since I worked in the real world before the internet, and I was there in 95, 96, 97 during the beginning of all of the implementation, the internet was sold to all of us by the major tech companies as being the great thing to solve all the inefficiency of the prior 20 or 30 years. And when I was at Northwestern at the time, and when we first got internet on campus, many of the faculty did not want email addresses because they knew they would get inundated with hundreds, if not thousands of emails, which caused the president to issue a policy change saying everybody employed at Northwestern will have to have an email address and all official communication will go there. You couldn't leave it up to the faculty to make their discrete choice. It was an executive decision. Some people would say maybe the internet has had many good things, but there are many downsides to it. And
unexpected
nobody talked to us about that. There was no cost benefit analysis. The president of the United States didn't come on and say, well, we're going to implement the internet. These are the pluses, these are the minuses on a whiteboard. I mean, everybody's just jumped in and it's great. I think it was meant to be a Wild West too. But
sure. I think that's the issue, right? I think one of the problems is that things, not just technologically, and it's really difficult to really understand to what extent technology informs the rapid cultural changes and vice versa. But things are happening so quickly that people can't really get a foundation, and their underpinnings are shifting so rapidly.
Right.
There's all these unintended consequences. I think one of these things too, I've always thought about, your example of email on campus, right?
Yeah.
The notion that you had some Luddites maybe that didn't want to go gracefully into the good light, but then a decree was made and they had to adopt email. I think this, and we'll talk about this. I want to get to a couple other definitions, but this notion of the opt-out, and I don't mean technologically the opt-out, but I've talked to a lot of professionals that still seem to believe that you do have choice when it comes to technology. The choice is that you don't use it. If you don't want to be impacted by Twitter or the YouTube algorithm, then don't get on. But I don't think that's a very fair assessment, because I think to interact, those are our town squares now. And to be a productive member of society in many ways and to be informed, you do have to participate. And if you are in what seems to be a public forum like Twitter, but then Twitter does have some of these content controls and this content monitoring, you then get into this current debate of kind of when Elon Musk is, his whole issue in buying Twitter is, to what extent do private corporations get to regulate public speech? And then now you have algorithms impacting the First Amendment, which I think has a whole host of new implications. Now, the thing is, you can't just opt out of that. I mean, you can if you want to go, live out in the woods and have a tent and a campfire, which is fine for many folks. But I think that the choice of not participating is becoming less and less of a viable option. The same way that you could say, okay, well, if you don't want to say anything dumb or you don't want to risk being offensive, don't speak. Those aren't viable options, I think. And I think as technology grows, I think people are going to have less and less of that option to just tune out, if you will.
Right. Right. And that is either a explicit or an implicit nudge to get people to get with the program.
So let's talk about nudges real quick, if we can, James. So we talked about algorithm. Let's quickly define, because I think you lay out 3 definitions that kind of get us to nudge. So algorithm we defined. What's algorithmic decision making?
Those are decision systems put in place that are built around algorithms, which are then tasked to make certain decisions. Okay. Now, for instance, most local and state governments have to balance their budget every 2 years. The federal government doesn't have to balance its budget. That's what it can do. But local governments need to balance their budgets. And let's say you got a tax shortfall. And with all the spending, all of a sudden, you're going to have to cut a couple positions or leave more positions vacant in your city government. Some governments now are turning to algorithmic decision-making for low-level, easy, functionary decisions, because they don't have to have human beings with fringe benefits and all that, salary increases and possible unionization and all this. And so algorithmic decision-making, once again, such as the limitations of algorithms themselves, what is going in, right? And how impartial and accurate is the data? We don't really know that. With algorithmic decision-making, the architecture is algorithms, but that's never explained to the population. I've yet to hear a mayor talk about it or any city official talk about it. And so, this is what they call the black box syndrome in tech, which means there's a lot going on with algorithms behind the scenes that maybe not even all the engineers fully know what's going on. And if they don't understand what's going on, how do you expect a department head or a member of the Common Council or a mayor to understand? And how do you expect them to explain to the population, maybe some of whom don't have enough education to grasp what is going on behind the scenes, because all that they're concerned about really is the end result. How's this going to balance the budget? So algorithmic decision-making is being used, but it's not being fully explained in any area. The lack of transparency in the whole algorithmic realm with respect to the general population is widely acknowledged to be a problem.
And James, that begs the question of, at what point does this black box you talk about, at what point does the nature of the algorithm become just too much for the average consumer to understand? So even if you have the best intention to be transparent, not everybody has the sophistication to understand how the algorithm works. And I liken this to the credit score. When you look at freecreditreport.com or any kind of credit monitoring agency, you look at it and the factors. You may have no clue about how it's actually compiled to make your credit score, but you at least know my credit score sucks because I went over my limit, my ratio's bad, and I got a couple default judgments. So I'm wondering is that going to be more of the angle you see developing laws take? Is it going to be more about describing factors to individual consumers, or is it going to be simply that individuals are going to have to become more savvy when it comes to how these algorithms actually work, actually get into the black box a little more?
Well, is that
reasonable?
Well, I think we have to try. It's a very heavy lift. I read the other day that 23% of the U.S. population has a college degree. So the percentage that are computer scientists or computer engineers that do the actual algorithmic work on the back end is much less than that. And so there does need that. And that's, I think, why I continue to focus on the educational component, because it's not being discussed publicly. Okay. Transparency is a great idea, but I don't think it's very common. Even in the credit scoring area, which is an area, by the way, that is not really regulated by the U.S. government. The credit scoring companies are just companies. They are not seriously regulated. Nobody should even attempt to make that argument. But to the extent that, yeah, if you go to TransUnion and there is like A, B, C, D, E, F in descending matter of importance as to what impacts your score, it's still a black box because they'll say, well, okay, these are your files, and then it spits out a score. You don't see the actual mathematical computation. And what happens if the data is wrong? This is where you get into the whole breaches of financial information, of which I saw a lot when I'm doing M&A work in the e-discovery realm. When you have companies buying each other up, all of a sudden there's a lot of private data that you're bringing over from another company. And then you have to look at the data protection aspects of that. And so it's a very heavy lift all across the sectors. And it's a heavy lift for government. You're a lawyer like me. More often than not, the law reacts through statute or regulation to problems that have been brought to the attention of the courts or the legislatures or the president. And so that's historically been the issue and the reaction. But, we're not in the 1850s anymore. Right? And it's not even 1950. And so trying to stay abreast, this is going to be a heavy lift. Right. And the whole educational aspect is something I thought a lot about because the ABA puts a big focus on civics education. When half of America's kids, if not more, don't know the three branches of government, don't know American history, you got adults that don't know. You got senators that can't even name people in their own states. And so the ABA has, through Law Day and all that, has made a really good effort in pushing civics education. But now, and yes, they're pushing STEM education, at high school and college and grad school level. But once again, algorithms, that whole technology side of life, that needs education too. And where are we going to get all the time for this? I mean, we can't go to school 24/7, 362 days a year. And so it is a heavy lift. I admit that. And when you talk about machine learning and you talk about how the data is getting so much bigger, that algorithmic decision-making has to go to increasingly sophisticated models. And I understand that because I worked in the research realm at universities, where a lot of basic research is done based upon scientific inquiry. Yes, there's a ton of big data. It's not personal data in many cases. It's scientific. It's chemicals. It could be metals, whatever the scientist or researcher is working on. That's a whole different realm, but the numbers are getting so much bigger, not only in the R&D realm, but also in what we call the real world outside academia. And our elected officials need to make decisions based upon the best information they have at that moment. And if they're relying on algorithmic recommendations, that's where, I don't really break it out in the article, but there is algorithms that mandate, and then there's algorithms that recommend. And a recommendation algorithm is like going on Amazon and buying something and they say, well, you bought this, we recommend you get this. That's a recommendation algorithm. Some of them give you a better feeling of making a choice.
Sure.
Some of them,
whether they do or not. Yeah,
some are a little more sneaky. It's like in the article with the 23 different types of algorithms. The one that, there's a few that scare me, but the one is subliminal priming.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I want to talk about that.
Right. Anything subliminal, no, it really should be transparent.
It's funny too, because at one point when you were talking, I almost got this notion that it sounds like the solution to consumers and individuals being able to keep up with technology and learn about algorithms is more algorithms, more technology. Well, so it's almost like 2001: A Space Odyssey is going to end up being a documentary, right?
Or it's Ground Hog Day.
Exactly. Well, so one question before we jump into our last two definitions and get into those 23 nudges you talked about. Does transparency really mean much when you don't have necessary enforcement mechanisms. And what I mean, I think about when we talked about credit score. So
Yeah.
even with the attempt of these companies to give you a sense of what goes into your credit score, if there's
Right.
bad information, I mean, I know many of us have been through it. I've had an issue with it.
Yeah.
Where trying to then use that information to change your score or get a result is very arduous. It's
Yes.
very difficult
Yes.
to then
Yes.
use that information. And that might be because the same companies that give it to you are the same ones that have to make a decision. And it
Yes.
might be better when you have kind of enforcement mechanisms. I know obviously with GDPR, having such a robust enforcement framework allows for there to be much more teeth in those
Yeah.
regulations. But I wonder, does transparency really mean anything? If there's, I mean, most of the state laws don't have private rights of action. And I know
Yeah.
that's a big issue. Without having robust enforcement, does transparency really mean anything?
Are you trying to make me happy, or are you trying to make me sad?
Choose your own adventure.
You know, you raise an important point. I mean, the GDPR, I think yesterday, is 4 years old.
That's
And
right. Yeah, we did a big birthday celebration on the channel for the third birthday.
Yeah,
Yeah,
May 25th, 2018. And even the Europeans recognize that much leaves to be desired for enforcing aspects of the GDPR. So they now that they've had it 4 years, they really need to start plugging in the holes in terms of enforcement. And I think that is what a lot of the next year is going to look like over on that side of the Atlantic. And I guess the CCPA in California would be the closest thing we have to kind of a GDPR-like structure here over in California. But once you get to the battle of an overarching U.S. privacy statute, you're going to have the same battle, because some of it is going, like the issue yesterday in Texas. Some regulation is always going to be perceived as an impingement on personal freedom. Should people be free to have FICO scores of 400? Well,
right.
yes, you know, and you'll be charged 150% interest on a $1,000 loan.
Yeah, I almost wonder if your point is exactly why there never could be an omnibus privacy law without there being something enshrined in the Constitution, because it seems like whenever you try and do something at the privacy level,
yeah,
someone will have the argument for how it might impinge a fundamental right. On whether it's gun control or any, the Fourth Amendment, different things like this. So I almost think it needs to be more enshrined at a foundational level for that to even be effective.
I agree with you 100%. I've been saying that for a couple of years now. There is a 1890 Harvard Law Review article, two authors, one being Samuel, the second is Louis Brandeis.
Brandeis, right?
They argue in there that there has always been a fundamental right to privacy in the United States, and that was the right to be left alone. That was written in 1890. Is that the conception we have now, when there are, instead of 15 million Americans, there are 330 Americans? Can we really be left alone?
It goes back to that point, James, that we talked about earlier, where I think especially folks like us that were around before the internet and kind of went through the internet.
Yeah.
I think there's this notion that ushering ourselves into the internet age was a choice. Mm-hmm. So we make a choice to engage the internet and to engage technology. I don't think that's the case. And so I think that notion of right to privacy, the right to be left alone, it's right. Can you be left alone in the digital age? Do I have a right to navigate the internet, to navigate the web and be left alone? And I think people that look at privacy as a consumer rights-based issue, who maybe see the internet and engaging tech as a choice, say you don't. Your choice is like engage or don't. And I think that that's a fallacy. I think that you don't have a choice to engage. You need to be able to use technology and these instruments to be able to be a productive, contributing global citizen.
Yeah.
In that regard, you don't have a choice.
Well, and I think I would never frame the issue of a fundamental right to privacy as something coming out of the field of consumers and the modern economy, because I think, like most of our basic in the first 10 amendments, a lot of those come out of hundreds of years of experience. It's political, it's social, it's cultural, right? And so I am very nervous about calling privacy should only be created because it's good for the consumer sector or any of that. We need to shoot for something better than just having it be a consumer driven right. It really needs to be something that is aspirational for the country. And maybe that does tie into the issue of the public welfare. And it goes to another definition I had in the March issue, algorithmic regulation. It's where the algorithms learn when they're making certain decisions. There's a feedback loop. And so they will learn and relearn. And that slowly gets us closer to the idea of artificial intelligence as you would find maybe in the movie The Terminator or something like that,
Sure.
where the machines are
Cyberdyne.
capable of increasingly accurate decisions when they learn based on prior decisions. And so that's where you get into the algorithmic regulation, where you can try and minimize risk through increasing use of AI and machine learning to have better decisions. Now, once again, I think from my personal standpoint, it's great to have machines that can recommend to me that we should take certain steps, but humans should make the final decisions. And I think once you cross the Rubicon and maybe that will come in my lifetime, that there are so many big decisions to be made that no one human is comfortable in making it, that you would actually abdicate that responsibility to machines. But machines don't have emotion. They don't.
Or Elon Musk. Or Elon Musk.
Or Elon Musk, and I don't follow him that closely. But the reality is I think I've seen enough in the privacy world, the breaches, what's gone on with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, what we've had with tampering in the election cycle, the last few election cycles, that in terms of regulation, you can't just let the private sector try and fix everything themselves.
Right.
You do need a 50-50 partnership with government. And that is not the conservative thing to say. That's probably not even what many US Republicans would say. But it needs to be a partnership between government and the private sector. Because I think even if you look at the internet since 1995, 1994, it's done many good things, but there have been high costs too.
Right.
And nobody knew what the costs were going to be. And I remember that. None of us got a choice, although I didn't get a cell phone till 2004. So I guess that made me kind of as a Luddite, right? But nowadays, a smartphone is integral for everything in life.
Right.
You use it to get in your house. You use it to get in a gate in your apartment complex. You use it for banking. A lot of things that you could maybe avoid getting a smartphone. Now you're all being forced to use them, even if your natural inclination is to just say, well, I'll just get a cell phone to make phone calls. And everything else I'll do at home on the computer. And so it's a heavy lift. That's all I can say.
Well, to harken back to Elon Musk, I mean, you think about the smartphone, and I forget where I saw it. It was on some YouTube video where Elon Musk was at a conference, and he was talking about how humans are basically already androids because of they're all connected to this smartphone. And so I wonder if, we think about algorithms and nudges as being separate from us, but if we are so connected to this technology, maybe they're not as separate as we think. And maybe the fact that we're habitually using these pieces of technology, some of those algorithms, and this is the scary thing, might be becoming more hardwired into our decision-making process than we actually realize. And so let's jump right into that. So we define, and actually, before I do that too, James, there's one question I wanted to ask you, and I think you might have answered it. You mentioned that privacy has to be more than a consumer rights issue. But
Right.
it appears that a lot of the enforcement mechanisms, whether it's Section 5A of the FTC Act or the Fair Credit Reporting Act or the
Yeah.
Equal Credit Opportunity Act, all of the mechanisms around which loose privacy rights, if you will,
Yeah.
or privacy protections are enshrined in law, are all based around consumer issues. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, again, it goes back to that notion that we have to fundamentally change how we feel about privacy. Obviously, in Europe, the right around privacy, a lot of that emanated from history in World War II and how data
Yeah.
was used in very,
Yeah.
very, very evil ways. And you would think, I mean, in America, we have a similar history. I mean, data has been used in nefarious
Sure.
ways for a long time. I do wonder why there's that disparity and why we can't look to Europe to maybe take a page. And I guess California has done that, right?
I would say part of the resistance to incorporating some of those ideas from the European continent is the idea of American exceptionalism, that we are, as has been so recently uttered, the greatest country in the history of planet Earth, maybe the entire solar system. And it's that sort of language that I'm like, well, we got some things to fix here, folks. And if you start talking about saying, hey, the Europeans are doing it the right way, we should do it that way here in America, then you'll get called a socialist.
Sure.
Maybe even a Soviet socialist.
Well,
Wow.
it's interesting though, because there's still a lot of parallels. So, I mean, thinking about the concept of American exceptionalism, it's quite interesting because there are certain privacy concepts that parallel between America and the EU.
Absolutely. Yeah.
FIPS, for example, there's some parallels between FIPS and principles enshrined in the GDPR.
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans looked to FIPS, which were promulgated in 1973, and they used those for the beginning versions of their privacy laws over there, culminating in the GDPR. I'm not saying that FIPS is integrated into the GDPR, but the Europeans came to America looking at FIPS for guidance in how they were starting to develop their own privacy regimes. So,
and for those viewers out there, FIPS is Fair Information Privacy Practices.
Yes. It's like I'm creating a class right now on privacy for research administrators. And two of the documents I'm going to have them read are that 1890 Harvard Law Review article and also FIPS. Read those principles, because those are still valid today. And I completely agree with you. The right to privacy should, however you articulate that, should be in the Bill of Rights, should be codified across relevant areas of the statutory regime of the U.S. government. You know, some of the federal statutes you mentioned with Fair Credit Reporting Act and those, that all needs to be updated in light of rapid advances in technology and all that. But on the basic level of the Europeans saying privacy is a human right. Your personal data is yours. Sometimes our leaders should just come out and say the obvious and then put it in writing. And that's what leadership is. Sure. And enough on that.
So let's jump into nudges. So as we come to the close, and again, James, I'm going to have to literally, this is why I love doing this, because the best laid plans, right? We come into this having a discussion. I love keeping things on track, but way more than that, I love how the discussions evolve. And there's so many things we touched on, whether it be smart cities, enforcement regimes, how privacy is handled around the globe, the social scoring policy in China. So there's a lot of things I need to bring you back to talk about. But let's talk about nudges real quick. So we defined algorithm. We defined algorithmic decision-making. We define algorithmic
regulation, right?
What is a nudge?
Nudges have been around far longer than the modern personal computer. I mean, people have always been nudged, even 100 years ago. Okay, advertising itself is nudging, right? I mean, it's like you'd say
persuasion, right? It's
persuasion.
Snake oil salesman, right?
You know, but the difference now, as opposed to 1950 or 1900 or 1850, is the amount of data that's being thrown at you constantly. And oftentimes the prompts to make decisions right then, here, and now rather than saying, let me go home and think about it for a day or two, right? Or a week or whatever. So nudges are ways in the algorithmic context to have you make a decision that they want you to make, while also giving you the, at least superficially, the options to choose other things. It's not the gun to the head sort of form of persuasion. It's a far more subtle form of persuasion. So there may be three choices and they're nudging you toward one, but the other two are actually quite reasonable also.
This concept of nudge too, this was originally the term. There was an article by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, right? They were the ones that described this whole concept of nudge. I like the notion of the nudge being around, it just being a part of persuasion, right?
Yeah.
I think of it in terms of, the impulse buys at the store.
Right.
Or
Right.
in doing some research, all these things I never really thought of as being nudges. And I'm like, oh, that's really, really clever. Kind of like whenever I'm at Target, I noticed that they put, I have a 6-year-old and they put candy at eye level of 6-year-olds.
Yeah.
So, because I'm looking up and I'm seeing magazines, and then all of a sudden he comes out of nowhere with a Snickers bar or something. And I'm like, where did you find that? And I realize it's on the lower levels. Or all the interesting ways that grocery stores and different retailers use nudges to kind of direct you into different things. So we think of nudging in a good way and nudging in a bad way.
Right.
And I want to talk about some of these types of nudges. And one of the great aspects of your article, and I believe you use this image in both pieces of the series,
Absolutely,
is this chart that lays out categorically 23 nudges. And I want to pull it up right now on the screen for the viewers, and we'll talk through some of it. Okay, James. So we're actually in the article right now, and we're looking at these 23 distinct nudge mechanisms. Now, we obviously don't have time to go through all of them, although that'd be pretty cool. But can you describe briefly just the layout of this chart? And then maybe talk about some of the more evil nudges, if you will.
Well, you have 6 categories of nudges: facilitation, confront, deceive, social inference, fear, and reinforce. You also have 4 quadrants: reflective and automatic, north to south on the y-axis. On the x-axis, you have non-transparent and transparent. And what you can see with this chart, which I have in both issues of the Wisconsin Lawyer, is you can see that most of the nudging types sit within the upper right and lower left quadrants. Most of them are either in the reflective transparent quadrant or in the non-transparent automatic quadrant. Now, my argument in the article is that, consistent with democracy, with ideas of choice and consent, that nudges that sit within the reflective and transparent quadrant would be the most preferable, because that is how you support democracy and choice and consent in society. Some of these are rather funny. Reflective, transparent, right on the line, throttling mindless activity. Okay, well, there's a lot of mindless activity on the internet, right? Automatic are quick nudges that, boom, they just trigger automatic responses. And that's why when you looked at the lower left, where I talk about subliminal priming.
What is that? Describe what subliminal priming is.
Well, I mean, that's subliminal priming is getting you to think in a certain way to make that decision, whatever the decision is made. And subliminal would give the idea that it's not a reflective, meaning a thought, considered choice. And priming really is another word for getting people to make certain choices. You want to get them, I'm not going to say it's educational or the result of considered education, but you're priming people to take certain steps. And when I thought of the idea of a nudge, you talk about the evil and the positive nudge, right? I would state it a little bit differently, which means that nudging people to buy a better quality toilet paper is entirely different than nudging people to take certain steps in the governmental political sphere.
Sure.
I know we don't like hierarchies because we're being told these days that everything is basically the same, but buying better candy, being nudged that way by Walgreens is entirely different than being nudged by a Republican or Democrat presidential candidate. Or worse, there's going to be a social demonstration downtown. Bring your shotgun, right?
Sure.
And so the context of where the nudges appear also needs to be considered too.
What about certain nudges? Like I know with Uber, like there's a gamification aspect to it where if you're an Uber driver, let's say you set the amount of money, you want to earn $120 in a given day, and you put that into your app. And then when Uber recognizes that you're ending your quote unquote shift, it kind of prompt you for what the next fare could be, kind of goading you into wanting to work that extra little bit. And ultimately that's good for consumers and the riders. But my understanding is that the more Uber drivers there are, that can actually push rates down. So essentially you have drivers who are being nudged to working longer hours for the same amount of money. And is that ethical? And I mean, or can you just throw that into the whatever's good for the consumer type of pot?
Well, I think the company would always say it's better for the consumer, but does every company always have consumer interests as number one in their thought processes? I would argue it's never always that way to be the case, unless they're caught, in which case, then yes, then they apologize and then they fix things. But I mean, it's like I say, part of the impetus for the article in March in particular was what went on in the political realm with what goes on in government, and probably less with the Uber or the toilet paper example. But what you see here is you can see the entire wide range of what nudges do.
One of the nudges that they spoke about, Thaler and Sunstein spoke about in their article, was an airport in Amsterdam that put a fly in the urinal. And apparently it nudged people to be more clean and aim better. And it kind of created cleaner airport bathrooms. And I don't know if it was an example from the article, but there's another one that was also an airport where they painted the stairs to almost look like a racetrack.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
People into using the stairs. So I'm thinking, though, when algorithmic nudges come to mind in a positive context, the first thing I go to is DEI efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts when it comes to race and gender, and nudging in that way. But then a part of me argues, okay, there's a notion of things being fair, and then there's a notion of kind of nudging in certain directions. And I wonder, what would be an example of a positive algorithmic nudge? Like it's easy to think of the evil examples, the bad examples.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of one that would be a positive one? Maybe I'm assuming maybe in the smart city context when it comes to the efficient use of certain transportation modes and things of that nature.
Well, I would think the last electoral cycle being an exception, but we've had declining voting patterns in this country for a good 50 years. And I would love to see ways to enhance voting at all levels in the United States. And I'm sure there would be ways to create nudges that provide incentives. And I'm not talking money,
No, that's a great idea, though.
Like here's $50 to vote. I'm not saying that.
Right. But gamify voting, almost like the badges with Uber or Peloton, or there's different ways to gamify it. That's really interesting. One thing though about this chart that strikes me as interesting, it seems to me that opting out, whether it's the default nudge, if you will, but that seems to be in many regards, at least at the legal level, the go-to way to try and protect individuals in this realm. But yet opt out on the chart is is more towards the negative ones. Am I just reading that into the chart, or because it's a green facilitate one, despite it being non-transparent and automatic in that quadrant, it's still positive?
I mean, I would say on an operational level, many opt-out policies are still difficult to read and understand. Opt-out policies are often very long. They're very wordy. They're very legalistic. Once again, some people will not take the time to read an opt-out because it's too long or too full of legalese.
Right. Opt-out fatigue, right?
Yeah, and that's why I think it sits in the non-transparent area, because many opt-out policies are not completely transparent. But I would say it's sitting down in the more or less in the automatic, although it's not as bad as some of the others. It's sitting in the automatic because it's always something that you have to deal with to accomplish your task, whatever it is. So that's why I'd say it's down there. And I do know that, especially in Europe with the 4-year anniversary of GDPR, that opt-out is still a widely discussed dimension of GDPR. And I think some improvements need to be made in that regard too.
And I think with opt-out, that goes back to something we discussed at the beginning, which is this notion that how viable is it to opt out?
Yeah.
Is it really a choice to not even play the game?
Right.
And
right.
I don't think that that's fair. I've seen in the context of the CCPA and developing modes of how to actually take action around protecting privacy.
Right.
So individuals talking about opting out at the device level, as opposed to having that opt-out fatigue. But even then, I know for when I'm looking at a site or I'm doing something new online, typically when I get to an opt-out policy, I'm wondering, you know what? I don't even know what functionality I'm going to now not get.
Yeah.
Because I'm opting out. And if you want to enjoy the full experience of whatever you're trying to do, I think that's where people tend to go, you know what? Screw it. I'm just gonna go in. And then it's like, aha, oh, you made the choice. You're now subject to everything we want to do. And I think that really harkens back to that notion of education that you talked about. And really, we're in this really wonky stage in history where, like we said, there's so much disruption happening with technology. You know, have humans evolved to be able to process everything that's happening in a way that gives us meaningful choice? And that comes back down to what I think is really great you've set out. And again, I want to encourage everybody. I'm going to post, James, links to both articles from the Wisconsin Lawyer, but definitely all of you out there, go out and read those two pieces. They lay out the issues very succinctly. And James, we're going to definitely have to bring you back. I love how these conversations evolve. And I know there's a lot of different things that we can branch off into. I'm going to encourage everyone out there to read the 2-part series from the Wisconsin Lawyer. It's a fantastic piece. But James, we always like to end with providing some survival tips for our viewers. Is there 1 or 2 survival tips that you could provide our viewers out there when it comes to algorithmic nudges?
Well, consistent with the idea of education, I think knowledge is power. And I think one way to become better versed in algorithms and nudges and where they fit into the broader scheme of things, not just consumer goods, but issues of democracy and choice and consent. There's a lot of resources out on the internet. I would encourage you to do your own research, kind of what I did. Maybe start with the 1890 Harvard Law Review article, and then go to the FIPS at the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, if you're old enough to remember HEW. So I think those are some suggestions. And as I would, in closing, say, if you are a lawyer and in the ABA and you're not a member of the Science and Technology Law section, you should join us. We got a couple of good privacy sections in there, and a lot of people from different sectors that are working in data protection and privacy. And we'd welcome your attention there also.
We'll include a link to that as well. And I like that. So we can almost bookend the research here. So we have the 1890 Warren Brandeis Harvard Law Review article. And then I would encourage folks, although it's not directly on algorithmic nudges, but more on facial recognition and bias in AI, that Netflix documentary Coded Bias. But
Yes.
also I would encourage folks, we talked about the grocery store nudge, right? Just
Right.
be a little more savvy, think a little more when you're online or when you're on your phone, while you're making the decisions you're making, you know, try and see if you can look into the matrix and see the ones and zeros falling down, and have a little more interest and understanding in how these different applications and how technology is influencing your decision-making process. I think that's a really good cap on how free are we in the digital age.
Yeah.
I think this is great. And,
I was going to say, when I'm in the grocery store and you go in the checkout line and you have about 80 different types of candies staring at you, you know, it's very hard for me to turn down the Reese's peanut butter cups.
Well, I need to go to a grocery store where they nudge you towards the celery and the broccoli. Maybe they should put some
cauliflower. Yeah,
exactly. But James, again, I can't thank you enough for joining us on ESI Survival Guide. Everyone out there, please, if you like the video, feel free to hit the like button, drop us a comment, and of course, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell to get notified when new videos come out. And again, love to thank my guest, James Casey. James, I'm going to bring you back. We have a lot more to talk about. And with that, this is Matt with ESI Survival Guide, telling you all out there to please stay safe in the electronic wilderness. See you next time.
Yeah. Thank you.